few years ago, I was teaching storytelling in northern India, and I wanted to tell my students a story as a model of how to do storytelling, and I wanted to tell a story that would be familiar to them. So I started talking about Emperor Akbar, and Emperor Akbar was one of the great Moghul emperors of northern India. Now, Emperor Akbar had a court, obviously, and he built a court of wise and great courtiers, advisors, viziers, and they were known as the jewels. And the greatest jewel of all, and as soon as I said that, I said the greatest jewel of all was called, the whole room, every student shouted back at me, Birbal. So this is an Akbar and Birbal story, and there are many of them. The problem with being an emperor or a king is that you have a lot of worries during the day, which can make sleeping difficult. And Emperor Akbar certainly had trouble sleeping. And so what he did was he insisted that each of his jewels, his courtiers, one night would have to come and tell him a story if he didn't get to sleep. So they took turns trying to stay awake all night, waiting for the little bell next to Emperor Akbar's bed to ring. So they knew they had to go and tell him a story to send him to sleep. And this went on for week after week, and the poor courtiers were getting very fed up with this. And it came to Birbal's turn. And so Birbal was sitting, trying to stay awake, while Emperor Akbar was trying to get to sleep. And of course, he couldn't get to sleep. So in the middle of the night, he rang the little bell, and at the sound of the tinkling bell from the other end of the corridor, Birbal jumped up and ran down to the king. And the king, from his bed, said, Birbal, I cannot sleep. Please tell me a story. And so Birbal sat down and said, Here, your majesty, is my story. Once upon a time, there was a farmer, and the farmer wanted to make sure that his crop was safe, that his crop was kept dry and clean and away from anyone or any animal who would steal it. And Emperor Akbar said, then he is a very sensible farmer who thinks ahead. And Birbal said, yes, your majesty. And so he built himself a grain store that he could seal. So he could seal so that no air could get in, no water could get in, no animals could get in, no person could get in. And Emperor Akbar said, this is indeed a wise farmer. And then Birbal said, but, your majesty, there was a problem. And Akbar said, I knew it! A problem. A story always has to have a problem. Tell me, what was the problem, Birbal? And Birbal said, your majesty, the farmer had missed one corner just at the top of the building, and it was weaker than the rest of the building, and there was a crack in it, and the crack developed into a small hole. And Emperor Akbar said, and he wanted to keep everything out. He wanted to keep the air out, he wanted to keep the water out, he wanted to keep the animals out, he wanted to keep thieves out. And Birbal said, indeed, your majesty, he did. And there was a tiny hole, and that hole was big enough for a sparrow. And a sparrow saw the hole and squeezed down through it and stole a grain of the farmer's wheat. And then it squeezed back through the hole and flew back to its nest. And Akbar said, so what did the farmer do? And Birbal said, no, your majesty, we haven't got the farmer yet. And so the next day, the sparrow flew back to the grain store, squeezed in through the little hole, and took a grain of wheat, squeezed out again, and flew back to its nest. And Akbar said, and now the farmer? And Birbal said, no, your majesty. The next day, the sparrow flew back to the building, found the little hole, squeezed through it, took a grain, and then squeezed back through the hole and back to its nest. And he went on like this. And we'll leave him going on like that for a little while. We're going to take a break while Birbal continues telling Emperor Akbar the story. And we're going to the south of India, where the equivalent of Birbal is Tenali Raman. And Tenali Raman is the jewel of his king's court. And Tenali Raman was in the court one day when two courtiers challenged him to tell them the story of Rama and Sita. Now, the story of Rama and Sita is a very big story, classical Indian mythology. And Tenali Raman said, "You want the whole story?" And they said, "Yes, you are meant to be a jewel of this court. You are meant to be the cleverest man in the kingdom. You tell us the story of Rama and Sita." So Tenali Raman said, "Very well. This is the story of Rama and Sita." And this is the story he told them. One day, Rama and Sita were walking through the forest. The courtiers said, "And?" And Tenali Raman looked at them and said, "Shh." And the courtiers said, "But what happens next?" And Tenali Raman said, "We can't go on to what happens next until they finished walking through the forest, and it's a very long walk. So let's leave them with Rama and Sita walking through the forest, and we'll go back to Birbal, telling his story to Emperor Akbar, who is lying in bed, listening. And the sparrow flew down from its nest, found the building, found the little hole, squeezed in, took a grain and flew back to its nest. And Akbar had had enough. This story had been going on for so long, and yet nothing seemed to have happened. And he said, "When are we going to get to the next part of the story? When is something going to happen other than the bird taking a grain from the store?" And Birbal said, "Your Majesty, this is a store for a farmer's crop. Nothing will happen until the sparrow has emptied it." And so Emperor Akbar, who continued not to sleep well, no longer asked for Birbal to come and tell him stories, and Birbal could get a good night's sleep. And so those are two stories, one of Birbal and one of Tenali Raman, about the advantages of knowing how to tell a story, how to tell it well, and how to leave people waiting when you want them to. And those were my stories from India, and that was how I have told them to you.